This Ohio school teacher presented herself as the kind of person you would want in the classroom, a family and community-oriented mom dedicated to raising young people with a love of baking. But police say she did the unthinkable. The teacher is now facing charges for allegedly sexually assaulting a minor. We're on the case presented by Law and Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. This is the type of story that leaves you wondering, how could this happen? How could someone who is entrusted with educating and raising, allegedly, become a reported predator? Today we're diving into another one of these cases, this time in the tiny town of Monroeville, Ohio, population 1,300. It's about an hour's drive from Cleveland. It's home to Monroeville High School, which has only an enrollment of roughly 250 students, grades 7 through 12. This school hired Holly Bauer as a 7th and 8th grade social studies teacher. Here's the Facebook post introducing her to the school community in 2021. It says that she grew up in the town. She was an alumnus of this high school, and she was excited to be back teaching there. Her social media paints her to be a person who's all about family, with many pictures of her and her kids. But the person you see in these postcard quality family portraits, the person who mentioned a love of baking and running an at-home bakery in her About Me post on the school's social media, looks very different from the person you see in this mugshot just released by the Huron County, Ohio Sheriff. The sheriff sent us a news release announcing Holly Bauer's arrest. It reads that after a 6-month investigation, the already suspended Monroeville Local Schools teacher, we'll get into that detail in just a minute, was arrested and charged with rape. That is a first-degree felony. The sheriff went on to say they executed multiple search warrants and subpoenas. The evidence came from social media and electronic service providers. The sheriff added the offenses happened in early 2022 and late 2023. I asked the sheriff's office for more details on this case and the evidence that they have, the police report, but they said they couldn't release any of that because this case is still ongoing. The sheriff did say investigators are continuing to review the case and more evidence could be presented to a grand jury involving Bauer. It's unclear who the victim was and how old they were. The local jail doesn't list Bauer as still on their inmate roster, but Cleveland TV station WKYC says that jail records did show that Bauer is accused of unlawful sexual contact with a minor and sexual battery as well as burglary. This isn't the first time that Bauer has been in the news for her alleged conduct. We mentioned that she was already suspended from the school. Take a look at this story published in October 2024 by the local Ohio newspaper, the Sandusky Register, titled Monroeville Teacher Suspended. That paper writes that Bauer was placed on leave in September of last year pending the outcome of an investigation. The paper says that Bauer was reprimanded in June 2022 for an inappropriate and unprofessional relationship with a student, including by engaging in or permitting unwarranted physical contact with a student while in their classroom and by using the student in furtherance of personal errands. The paper says it's unclear what took place, but the personnel file says the superintendent directed Bauer to maintain an appropriate professional relationship with that student in question. It is unclear whether the rape charge is connected to this student or this incident. The sheriff did say the incidents in the case were connected to early 2022 and late 2023. I did reach out to the school's principal for comment, but at the time of this recording, we have not heard back. The stories we cover here at Law and Crime prove that life can be unpredictable, and having a great attorney matters, and that's where we bring in our partners at Morgan & Morgan. Morgan & Morgan is a law firm with more than 1,000 attorneys, and they have a history of winning big for their clients. Just in the last couple of months, they were able to secure $9.3 million for a car crash victim in Florida, $5.6 million for a car accident victim in Atlanta, and in a case in Kentucky, they were able to secure $1.8 million, and that was after the insurance company was just going to offer $5,000. So even if you don't think your case is worth millions of dollars, why not file a claim and fight for what you deserve? Morgan & Morgan makes it so easy. Take a look at this video. I gave it a shot myself. You can file a claim in just 8 easy clicks on your phone. What you can do, head over to forthepeople.com/OTC to file your claim today, or you can click the link that we have pinned in the comments. Joining us now to talk about this case a little bit more is Dan Shore, a sexual misconduct investigator and author. Dan, I know you have a lot of experience looking into cases like this one that happen where teachers are accused of sexual misconduct. First, before we kind of get into generally, I want to just talk about how these cases happen because it's always such a shock when you read the headline. What stands out to you with some of the details we're getting on this case out of Ohio?
Sure. Well, I started my career as a sex crimes prosecutor about 25 years ago, and now I spend most of my time doing sexual misconduct investigations with educational institutions. So, this case, you have an older teacher who's accused of sexual misconduct with an underage student. As in many of these cases, a lot of the details have not been made public yet, but certainly this is not the first time we've seen a fact pattern like this, and it's really important whether it's law enforcement or the school doing an investigation that they're thorough, they're complete, they're fair to all sides, that they make sure this defendant has due process, and that we also review how the school has handled this situation or similar situations in the past, because that's a big part of these investigations is making sure there's a review of why wasn't this detected earlier, if it did occur, and what could be done differently in the future.
Yeah, because according to the press release we got from the sheriff in Huron County, Ohio, this was a 6-month investigation. And the two specific details that they put in about that investigation had to do with social media and some of the digital aspects. We don't know particularly what they found, but in your experience in these cases, how do these investigations work, especially over a 6-month period to get to the point where there's an arrest?
Well, many of these cases nowadays have a lot of electronic communication between people as individuals are engaging in a relationship. That could be text message, that could be social media interactions, that could be photos, videos, emails. So, a major part of any investigation is trying to detail the nature of the relationship from the beginning and what kind of interactions have been documented in electronic communication, because often that can either corroborate or contradict one or both sides' stories. And that's very helpful to law enforcement and also to schools. When I'm conducting investigations, I always want to preserve and obtain any available text messages between the relevant parties. That is crucial for an investigation like this.
And I'll just keep saying that we don't have all the details on it, but according to a newspaper in Sandusky, Ohio, that in 2022 there was some incident that happened with this teacher where she was accused of having some sort of inappropriate contact with a student, and then she was reprimanded for that. Um, how should schools handle these cases? You know, is it every single time that there's something where a teacher has a relationship with a student where maybe they're just very friendly, but it makes people uncomfortable? Does it always should it always go to law enforcement? Because it seems like this school tried to handle at least that particular incident internally. And again, I say that without knowing all the details of what happened beyond it being considered inappropriate at the time.
Well, many situations that a school would rightfully see as inappropriate are not crimes that law enforcement would investigate. So, let's say a teacher or an underage student are engaging in social media interactions that are inappropriate for a teacher to be having with a student, but maybe they're not overtly sexual, maybe they're not violating any criminal statute, but a school could rightfully think this is inappropriate for a teacher to be engaging in with a student, especially an underage one. That's a type of situation where you might have some type of review, some type of minor discipline or training, or at least a warning. And there are many, many investigations that I conduct for schools that aren't criminal violations because they don't rise to the level of a criminal sexual assault or some other criminal violation. But schools have an important responsibility under Title IX and other laws and statutes of different states to make sure that all members of their educational community are safe, that they're being treated fairly, that no type of sexual misconduct is interfering with their educational experience. So many of these investigations aren't law enforcement investigations, but then there are situations where there is concurrent jurisdiction where someone might have committed a sex crime that is a potential criminal violation, but also a school will investigate it. So sometimes the investigations I'm doing have concurrent jurisdiction with law enforcement.
How should schools handle it where if it's not a criminal case at that point, it's not something that police would be able to charge someone for, but then at the same time, you have this person, it's their employment to be a teacher. And I'm sure a lot of parents, if they even heard that there was some sort of concern that you wouldn't want your kids around that teacher, what's the best way for schools to handle that aspect of it, of whether or not that teacher should even be employed?
Well, it starts with the school's policy and procedures. So you want your school to have really clear policies and procedures about what is prohibited conduct, and that should be known to people. People should understand what is prohibited. People should know where to report the type of misconduct that violates the school policy. And then once there is an allegation or information about a potential policy violation, you really need an investigator who is fair, impartial. That could be someone internal to the school or external, but they can't be someone who has a conflict of interest. And that person should be doing a thorough, fair investigation that gives due process to the person who's accused, and then also provide support for the person making the accusation and the person accused. And then ultimately, you'll have a resolution of that investigation and determine whether or not the evidence shows that the school policy has been violated. And then depending on what the violation was, there would be a range of discipline, anything from maybe training about proper protocols for interacting with others in an educational environment to possible suspension or termination or expulsion if it's a student. So that's how this should go about when things work well. And then hopefully that leads to fairness to all parties and also safety for people at the school.
You look at this teacher, now a suspended teacher pending the outcome of her criminal case, and you look at her social media, and it's kind of this mom, the type of teacher. I think when you see her background, that on paper you're like, this is the type of person that you would want in a classroom. And I know it's wrong to say, because there are predators, alleged predators, that have all different backgrounds and look in all different, come from all different shapes and sizes. But how common is it that it is a female teacher that is accused of these crimes? Because so often I think people assume it's the male teacher that might be accused, and that maybe is just the way society has looked at it.
Sure, and I've been investigating alleged sexual misconduct, as I've said before, for many years, first as a sex crimes prosecutor, now as an investigator with different educational institutions. It is certainly less common to have a female respondent or a female defendant in cases like this, but it does happen. I've been seeing that fact pattern with an older female teacher and a younger male student ever since I was in the DA's office many years ago. So it does happen. It's not unique that this type of accusation arises, but certainly it's less common in my experience than male teachers. And one thing I wanted to say in general is that there's often a feeling in society that if you're concerned about sexual misconduct, it's the stranger who's going to harm you or harm your child, that they're going to snatch your child from a playground, or someone will, be walking on a dark street and be assaulted. And certainly those things do happen, but the much more common fact pattern I've seen for years is that sexual misconduct happens from people who are trusted, whether it's a trusted family member or authority figure with a child, or someone who's in a relationship with someone, or consenting to certain sexual activity, and then it goes beyond that line to non-consensual sexual activity. So often the person who is accused in these cases is someone who seems on the surface to be a trusted person, and that's often how they get in a position to violate that trust. And that's, you need an investigation to find out what the real facts are.
Yeah, and it's always tough to phrase that. It can be clunky to kind of phrase it, but I think that really gets to an important point. And it kind of leads to the next question I have, which I know is a loaded one. But so often when at least I read these stories, when I was reading this one, you just ask yourself, like, how does this happen? How does it get to the point where someone, in this case, a 42-year-old, is accused of having unlawful, inappropriate conduct with a minor? What is often the driving factor in these cases where you have teachers that cross the line?
It really varies. I've investigated a lot of cases like this, and sometimes there's someone who has a history of inappropriate relations with people that they're either teaching or an authority figure role with. Sometimes it's something unique about this particular interaction with this student. So it really varies. Another related important thing that any investigation has to look into is if these accusations are true, was the school aware of it earlier? Should they have been aware of it? Sometimes we see situations where people tried to report the types of misconduct that we're talking about here, and it did not lead to a meaningful investigation or any meaningful results. So a big part of these investigations, and this relates to your point of, how did this happen, is finding out not only why did it happen from the defendant's perspective, but also from the school. Could they have prevented this? What could they do in the future, either changing their policy and the procedures or notifying people to report this type of activity if they are aware of it? These are the types of things that an investigator really needs to look into.
Is it often cases of, maybe a teacher just really gets along with a student and then somehow you end up in this place that's over the line? Is how common is it for a teacher, maybe they're going through something wrong in their personal life and then that somehow leads them into this case? I mean, what are the driving factors that can act, not that any, and I'm not,
Mhm.
just how does it, it just kind of goes back to that point of like, how does it happen as a 42-year-old that you would be accused of doing something like this?
Sure. Well, the factors you mentioned are certainly possible. Every case is different, and we don't know the facts about this particular case to know enough. But I
Right.
would say one common theme I do see in many of the cases that I investigate with an older teacher and a younger student is the dynamic of power and control, and the person who's older in an authority position is using that position of authority, using this implied intimidation of being an authority figure, and they are using power and control dynamics to maybe get the person to spend time with them, and that escalates to certain boundary probing with inappropriate touching, and that can lead to an escalation in sexual activity. So those are some of the themes that I've seen when I've investigated similar cases, and as more facts come out, we'll probably learn more about what happened or what's alleged to have happened in this case. But certainly that those are issues that I see repeatedly.
Yeah, and my question is more to your point, just kind of like generally speaking, because I know at Law and Crime, like we cover these cases regularly, and it seems like they just
Mhm.
pop up almost on a weekly basis, where you have an older teacher and a younger student. Are these cases happening more, or are we just hearing about them more often?
In my opinion, we're hearing about them more often. As again, I started my career as a sex crimes prosecutor 25 years ago, and I saw these cases happening when I was handling them in the DA's office. I don't think they got as much publicity as they do now. It's very easy for a situation like this to go viral online, on social media, and people are talking about them more. So I believe people are more vocal about what happened. And sometimes that is good because that could help protect other people. Sometimes that's negative because it can hurt someone's reputation who's been accused, and
Right.
they are innocent until proven guilty. So there's a plus side to all the coverage about these cases. There's also a very negative side, and it's important to be responsible, as Law and Crime always is, to show in a balanced way what the facts are, what do we know, what we don't know, so that people can be aware of that.
Is social media, because I in this case, apparently there was a good amount of evidence that came from social media, but as social media has risen and now teachers can have contact and relationship with their students beyond school hours and beyond text messaging, have you seen social media almost drive these cases in making them more common, if there is something that's making these cases more common?
Well, schools generally have policies restricting social media interaction between teachers and students who are underage. That can be violated. People can do things secretly. Certainly, Snapchat's a big example of how you can have messages
Yeah.
with another person that there's no record of. So I see a lot of cases where people are referring to Snapchat exchanges that they had, but those aren't preserved for investigators or law enforcement to look at. But certainly, there's a lot of ways to communicate now that there weren't a few years ago. It used to be, when I was a student that age, at the end of the day, the teacher would go their way and the students would go their way, and that was the end of their interactions unless there was an after-school activity. Now there's so many ways to communicate, so many ways to arrange meeting, and that's why it's important for parents who have underage children who are students to monitor who they're contacting. The difficulty is, though, usually you feel, oh, they're contacting their teacher, that's good, that's safe. Most
Right.
parents would feel positive about that, right? If you're thinking, I don't want my child to contact dangerous people, you'll be relieved they're contacting their teacher. So that's what makes a situation like this even more difficult.
It's so difficult. I mean, I'm a parent myself. Like, you want your student to have that great relationship with a teacher. I mean, I've had great teachers in my life, but then there are these awful cases that are talked about. And as they become more, as we become more aware of them, we talk about them more often. How have you seen schools adjust in handling them? Are they handling these cases, by and large, schools handling these cases better than maybe they did when you were in a DA's office investigating?
Well, it's certainly better. I think there's still a long way to go. As I said, a lot of schools have now policies restricting interactions between teachers and underage students through social media, text message, things like that. And there are more and more schools now have clear policies and procedures, and there's investigators who are investigating these allegations to make sure there's due process for whoever's accused, but also there's meaningful response. But there are also a lot of schools that are unfortunately behind the times that haven't really had a situation that compelled them to take this as seriously as they should. I've seen that. So there's a big variety. There are many, many schools around the country. We're moving in the right direction, but certainly many schools need to catch up.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dan, I know you've as we've been talking, you've covered these cases for a long time. You've written about this as well, and you have a new book coming out looking at these particular issues that whether you're a parent, whether you're really anybody, it certainly grabs a lot of attention.
Yeah, my second novel, it's called Open Bar. It's coming out in August, and it is about a situation similar to this. And people can learn more by finding me on Substack. I have a Substack newsletter about books and writing, and often we deal with topics such as what we're discussing here today.
Yeah, it's so important. I hope people check it out. We really appreciate you, Dan Shore, coming on Law and Crime as always, because unfortunately we talk about these type of stories too often. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me on. It's great that you're covering it, and I'm happy to talk anytime.
Joining me now is former prosecutor and criminal defense attorney Josh Corman. Thanks for taking the time to be with us. I know you've seen these cases before, these types of cases where teachers are accused of improper misconduct, sexual misconduct with minors. What's your takeaway from what we know thus far in this story?
I think you're right. These are kind of cases we see a lot, and they seem to get a lot of attention. Sometimes the alleged perpetrators become relatively famous. It seems like we see a lot of these, like in Florida and whatnot. I think it kind of shocks us every time we see this that a teacher would be involved in something like this. But at the same time, as you said, these are things that we see time and time again. From the looks of just the charges, I know we don't know a lot about the facts of the case or the specific allegations, but based on the charges that have been filed, the rape charge and the sexual battery would indicate that the alleged victim is a student, and the student between the age of 13 and 16 based on the unlawful sexual conduct charge that she has.
When you look at the sheriff in the news release sent to us said it was a 6-month investigation. And over that time, they were able to uncover a lot of evidence from social media. In your experience, what does that investigation look like? And what does social media in these cases, what's it able to provide an investigator that can eventually lead to a charge as serious as the ones that this teacher is facing?
Right. So what I assume probably happened is somehow law enforcement got some kind of alert to this, whether there was a complaint filed by somebody or they became aware of it in some way. When I see a 6-month investigation, it makes me think that the officers probably issued subpoenas to maybe Facebook, Instagram, those kind of things. And when you issue that subpoena, investigative subpoenas, it will come back with just loads and loads of documents. Sometimes I've had cases with bankers' boxes full of documents regarding every post that someone made, all of the instant messages that are filed. The same thing with cell phones. When they get a search warrant to get someone's cell phone, they do a phone analysis, or what we call a phone dump, where they basically can copy every single thing that's in your phone, every picture, video, your GPS. Phones are gold mines of evidence right now. So I would assume that they would have done that they'll be reviewing everything in the phone, which would show any kind of text messages, phone calls, any communications that these people may have had together at all. Also, during these investigations, normally law enforcement and probably children's services would have made contact with the alleged victim in the case. The alleged victim may have done a forensic interview, which is the child advocacy centers have interviews set up to videotape interviews with children who are alleged to have been involved in some kind of abuse, sexual or physical abuse. So I would assume that those are all the things that have been going on the last 6 months for law enforcement and the prosecutor in this case.
And not to get too graphic specific, because there's so much that we don't know about this case, but when you see a rape charge, it's a first-degree felony against a teacher, what does that tell you about the type of situation that we could be dealing with?
Right. So the charges themselves, even though you're right, we don't know specifically much about the facts. The charge of rape means that there was sexual conduct, sexual penetration, and that could mean, again, we don't want to get too graphic, but that means some kind of penetration, however that penetration could have been. And that penetration could be digital, or it could be intercourse, as a lot of people would assume. The rape charge itself is certainly concerning because normally rape, and I think in Ohio the same, would involve either some kind of force or some type of a coercion, or that the person was not able to make their own decision, either because of some kind of mental impairment or because they were drugged or under the influence of alcohol or drugs. So that charge specifically, I think, is probably the most concerning. The other charges are kind of what you would expect. I think sexual battery in Ohio, there is a specific clause in it where someone may have some type of authority over a person. So it would relate to a teacher, a coach, cleric, counselor, law enforcement officer, that type of thing. Any type of those people that would have sexual contact with a minor because they were in some type of authority position. That's where I think the sexual battery and the unlawful sexual conduct with a minor, that's where those charges would stem from.
And stepping back from this story, we'll see how it plays out. I know in your career, this isn't the first case like this that you've seen. And it's always, though it feels like on a weekly basis, have stories like this that come out, they're always so shocking. And I know it's a loaded question, but I mean, how does this happen? How does it get to the point? I mean, in the case that we're talking about here, a 42-year-old woman eventually is accused of something as terrible as rape. And yet we see these stories continue to play out across the country.
You're right. I think every time we see one of these, it is kind of shocking that this could still happen, or that people put themselves in these positions. The little bit that I've seen in the media about this, it sounds like this is maybe not to this extreme, but there's been other situations where she had been, I guess, reprimanded or investigated before for maybe having an inappropriate relationship with a student. So for whatever reason, it sounds like maybe this is one of those people, one of those teachers that, has crossed the line and has relationships with students, or has a different type of relationship than obviously a teacher should have. And sometimes one thing leads to the next, and then, she's in this position. And, it's always then an issue of, when you have an alleged victim like this, there's no telling, and we don't know so far if the alleged victim is the one who came forward, or a parent found out because they found something in their child's phone, or another student alerted somebody. But that's going to become an issue for a prosecutor as well. As do you have a victim who's willing to cooperate or who wants to go forward, or is, like we've seen sometimes in these stories, you have a alleged victim who is in love with the perpetrator, is not cooperative, and certainly that's going to be an issue for a prosecutor.
In your experience, just what are some of the driving forces that get someone who's a teacher actually across the line to do something like this? Because it is just so shocking that it happens as often as it appears to.
I don't know. I don't think I ever had a teacher or knew of any teachers that any students had anything inappropriate going on with, or that was even, I guess, remotely discussed at all.
Right.
So, I guess kind of the same as anybody. I don't think this isn't one of these things where, as an attorney, I have any kind of inside scoop on it. I think for all of us, just going through our own lives, going through school ourselves, we kind of wonder, like, how did this happen? How do these teachers keep getting in these kinds of positions? And your answer is as good as mine. Like, it's just kind of baffling to us how people get themselves in this situation.
It really is. From the legal perspective, what we know from the sheriff's office at this point is that they're still looking to gather information, and that information could go to a grand jury. So presumably there could be more charges if information comes up. What, from your standpoint, if you were a prosecutor on this case, what does the timeline kind of look like? What are you still doing, even though you do have this major charge that the teacher's facing right now?
Sure. So again, since I don't practice in Ohio, I don't know specifically what their procedures are, but in other jurisdictions, typically there is an arrest at a lower level court. In Tennessee, we call it General Sessions Court. When I was in Missouri, we called it Associate Circuit Court. But essentially, there's two levels of court. When someone is first arrested, oftentimes they are in the lower level, and a lot of times cases will get disposed of there, lower misdemeanors. You may have a right to have a preliminary hearing in a lower court, but in order to be charged where you would have the right to a jury trial, a grand jury, in most state constitutions, that case needs to be indicted by a grand jury. So at some point in time, the case will be presented to the grand jury for an indictment. Again, in most jurisdictions, going in front of a grand jury isn't any big deal. There's kind of the joke that a grand jury would indict a ham sandwich, but a grand jury is oftentimes very much just a rubber stamp. The prosecutor would present just a little bit of evidence in front of a grand jury in order to get an indictment, which is just a charging document. Oftentimes, there's not even any witnesses present. There's no judge. There's no defendant. Sometimes there's not even witnesses called except for a law enforcement officer. So the amount of evidence that's required at a grand jury in order to get an indictment is very minimal. And it really is just kind of like a rubber stamp procedure just to get the charge filed into a circuit court or a higher court where a jury trial is available to both parties.
And for if you have a defendant who's facing a charge and then trial is slated to happen and then more who knows, and I'm not saying in terms of this case, but just generally speaking, and more charges are added, does it all need to go through that one trial for a person, or is it something where they could be convicted on a rape charge, and then if someone years later comes forward with more accusations and that can be corroborated, that more charges can be added to a defendant in a case like this?
Right. So that's a good question. So I think if you're talking about the same victim, then normally the answer would be that they all need to be filed in the same indictment, the same charging instrument. If other victims come forward later on and those victims or cases are to be prosecuted, then I think that would probably end up being a different indictment. And there could also be a situation that while this case is pending, if there are other allegations that come forward or other victims that come forward, those cases perhaps could be consolidated into one trial, but that would get into some kind of intricate, complex legal issues, whether joinder and severance, which one would be appropriate, if there is evidence that would be unfairly prejudicial to one defendant or the other. So it gets into a much more complicated thing. But oftentimes, you're exactly right. In these cases, there would be further investigations to try to see if there's any other victims out there, kind of like what we see with like the Bill Cosby case and a lot of those kind of cases where other victims end up coming forward. And sometimes those cases are consolidated, and sometimes those cases were consolidated in error and they end up getting sent back for new trials because they should not have been grouped together.
Yeah, and we'll see how this case plays out. I mean, I know each state has different jurisdictions, and it appears that the sheriff says that the investigation isn't over just yet, but certainly serious charges against this teacher, Josh Corman, former prosecutor, criminal defense attorney, joining us from Memphis, Tennessee. Thanks for the time. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Again, the Huron County Sheriff in Ohio says this case is still ongoing, the investigation is continuing, and anyone with information should call the number that we have on the screen. For On the Case presented by Law&Crime, I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.